August afternoon in 1978, on a stretch of Highway 33 in Indiana, the road became a witness. Three young women, Judy, Lynn, and Donna, were driving a 1973 Ford Pinto. They were just kids, really. They were heading to a volleyball game. They stopped to adjust a loose gas cap, and a Chevy van, moving at maybe 30 miles an hour, tapped them from behind. It wasn't a high-speed collision. It wasn't a head-on wreck. It was a nudge. In a sane world, that's a fender bender. You exchange insurance, you curse your luck, and you go home. But the Pinto wasn't built for a sane world. It was built for a deadline. When that van hit the bumper, the fuel tank didn't just crumble. It shoved forward, impaling itself on the bolts of the rear axle. The tank ripped open like a wet paper bag. Gasoline sprayed into the passenger compartment, and in a heartbeat, the interior of that little car transformed into a pressurized furnace. The doors jammed shut. The frame buckled just enough to lock them in.
Those girls didn't die from a car crash. They died because a corporation decided that their lives were a line item that simply cost too much to protect. To understand how we got to that highway in Indiana, you have to understand Detroit in the late 60s. It was a town under siege. Volkswagen was eating Ford's lunch with the Beetle. The Japanese were starting to trickle in with small, efficient machines that didn't leak oil or demand a king's ransom at the pump. Lee Iacocca, the fast-talking, cigar-chomping prince of the Ford Motor Company, was desperate. He wanted a subcompact. He wanted it light, under 2,000 pounds, and he wanted it cheap, under $2,000. He called it the 2000-2000 rule. In the glass towers of Dearborn, that rule was gospel. If you were an engineer and suggested a safety feature that pushed the weight to 2,001 pounds or the price to $2,001, you weren't just ignored. You were an enemy of the mission. Iacocca didn't want to hear about crumple zones or reinforced frames. He wanted a car that would crush the competition. He didn't care if it crushed the customers in the process. The development cycle for a new car usually took about 43 months. Iacocca demanded the Pinto be done in 25. That's not engineering. That's a sprint toward a cliff. When you move that fast, you don't solve problems, you hide them. To save space and keep the car short, the engineers did something that defies every instinct of safety. They placed the fuel tank behind the rear axle, with only about 9 inches of crush space between the bumper and the gas. But it gets worse. They didn't just put it in a vulnerable spot, they surrounded it with knives. The rear axle had protruding bolts. In a rear-end collision, those bolts acted like a hole punch. The tank would be driven forward, the bolts would puncture the metal, and the fuel would erupt. And because the Pinto used a unibody construction to save weight, a hit to the rear often caused the body to wrap around the doors. You couldn't open them. If you were in a Pinto that caught fire, you were in a locked room. The engineers knew. They saw it in the testing labs. Ford ran 11 secret crash tests on the Pinto before it went to market. In every single one of them, 11 out of 11, the fuel tank ruptured. In most, the car would have been a total inferno within seconds. So what did they do? Did they stop production? Did they redesign the chassis? No. They found a way to pass the 12th test. They fixed the car for the government by putting a piece of wood between the bumper and the tank, or by using a plastic liner that they had no intention of actually putting in the production models. They rigged the exam so they could sell a rolling fire trap to the American public. I've spent 30 years looking at the dark corners of human nature, but nothing quite prepares you for the Grimaldi Memo. Inside Ford, there was a document titled Fatalities Associated with Crash-Induced Fuel Leakage and Fires. It is perhaps the most damning piece of paper in the history of the American industrial complex. The engineers had calculated they could fix the Pinto's fuel tank problem. They could add a structural wrap or a nylon liner or move the tank. The cost? $11 per car. $11, the price of a decent steak in 1971. But Ford's bean counters sat down with their calculators and performed a cost-benefit analysis. On one side of the ledger, they put the cost of the $11 fix across the entire production line, $137 million. On the other side, they estimated how many people would likely burn to death or suffer horrific disfigurements. They guessed 180 deaths and 180 serious burn injuries. Then, they assigned a dollar dollar value to a human life. According to Ford's math, a human life was worth exactly $200,000. A serious burn was worth $67,000. They multiplied the deaths and injuries by those dollar amounts, added in the estimated cost of the burned-out cars, and came up with a total of $49.5 million. The math was simple. It was cold. It was efficient. It was $87 million cheaper to let people burn than it was to fix the cars. When you read that memo, you realize you aren't looking at a mistake. You're looking at a philosophy. It's the philosophy that says the individual is a rounding error, that the market is more sacred than the person. They didn't see mothers or fathers or children. They saw units and liabilities. They knew the fire was coming. They just decided it was cheaper to pay the settlements than to save the lives. The ghost of Richard Grimshaw. In 1972, a woman named Lily Gray was driving her new Pinto on a California freeway. It stalled. She was hit behind at low speed. The car exploded. Lily Gray died after several days of unimaginable agony. Her passenger was a 13-year-old boy named Richard Grimshaw. Richard didn't die. In some ways, what happened to him was a longer, harder road. He survived, but he was burned over 90% of his body. He lost his nose, his left ear, and much of his left hand. He spent the next several years of his life undergoing dozens of surgeries, trying to reclaim some semblance of a human face. When the case went to court, the jury didn't just see the facts. They saw Richard. They saw what $11 of savings looked like in the flesh. The jury awarded Grimshaw $125 million in punitive damages. At the time, it was the largest such award in history. They wanted to send a message that could be heard all the way in the boardroom in Dearborn. They wanted to discipline Ford. They wanted to tell them that you cannot put a price tag on the soul of a child. But the tragedy of the American legal system is that messages are often muffled by appeals and corporate maneuvering. The award was eventually slashed to $3.5 million. Still a lot of money, sure, but to a company that made billions, it was a parking ticket.
By 1980, the Pinto was a punchline, but it was a deadly one. The state of Indiana decided they had seen enough. They did something unprecedented. They didn't sue Ford for money. They indicted the Ford Motor Company on 3 counts of reckless homicide. It was the first time in American history that a corporation was charged with murder. The trial was a circus. Ford brought in the best lawyers money could buy. They fought to keep the Grimaldi Memo out of evidence. They argued that the Pinto was no more dangerous than any other car of its era, which was a bit like saying a leaky boat is fine because other boats also have holes. Ford was eventually acquitted. They won the legal battle, but they had already lost the heart of the American people. The Pinto was discontinued. The name became synonymous with disaster. Iacocca moved on to Chrysler, becoming a folk hero to some, but to those of us who remember the smell of scorched upholstery, he remained the man who chose the $11 savings over the 3 girls on Highway 33. The cost of doing business. We like to think we've grown past this. We have more regulations now. We have safety stars and 5-star crash ratings. We have airbags and sensors that can see around corners, but the ghost of the Pinto still haunts every boardroom in the world. The scandal wasn't just about a gas tank. It was about the distance between the person who makes a decision and the person who has to live with it. It's easy to sign a memo when you're sitting in an air-conditioned office in Michigan. It's easy to talk about acceptable risk when it's not your daughter in the back seat. The Ford Pinto taught us that when a corporation tells you they care about your safety, what they often mean is they have calculated the cost of your death and found it to be within an acceptable margin.